Hello, everybody. We are live.
Hello, everybody. I'm live too.
Yeah.
And somebody said to me the other day, I thought you were only virtual. And I said, well, no, here I am in person. My name is Ben McNally, and I am the manager these days, the temporary head of Ben McNally Books, which is in Toronto, and is moving for the second time in a year as we speak. So I'm about to be on King Street East, and for the longest time I was on Bay Street, and that was where I first met Hilary Davidson. And you know, she asked if she could launch her book at our bookstore, and I said yes. And she said, "Oh, you know, I'm very grateful to you for this." And I said, "Well, you know, our participation is somewhat selfish because, you know, we assume that you're going to be very famous one day, and when that happens, then you're going to remember that, you know, we were there for you when you started out." And that is certainly the case here. Hilary is fantastic. She's really a wonderful person, and we've launched more than one of her books, and she's done events for us in the past as well. And I guess the first book was called The Damage Done, right? You know, she wrote this book about a travel writer, and we were just really impressed. And from then, it's been strength to strength. Two different series. This is the second standalone novel, and wow, I mean, I'm so pleased at her success because she's been really great to us, and I can't think of anybody who deserves it more. And the other participant is Deborah Dundas, and you know, Deborah is as highly regarded as anybody in the book business who's not an actual author. She's fair, and she's enthusiastic, and she's always the first person that people call to do an interview, and there's a reason for that. She's engaged, she's engaging, and I don't think there's anybody in Toronto in the book business who's as well liked generally as Deborah Dundas. So you're in good hands tonight. I send you all off on a voyage with these two wonderful women, and I'll tell you that Hilary's told us earlier that she'll be coming to town at the end of July, so you'll be able to get books from us tomorrow. But if you want a signed book, we'll be able to arrange that as well. So you can get in touch with us at Ben McNally Books, and we'll give you all the details of that. But now that's it for me. Over to you, Deborah.
Ben, thank you so much for the kind words. They mean everything. So I really appreciate that. And I also want to invite the viewers to, as we're going along, if you have a question that you'd like me to ask Hilary, you can put it in the comments on Facebook, and I've got another iPad beside me. I'm multi-screening so that I can watch for comments, and we can get your questions to Hilary sort of straight away. So you're doing a virtual launch, but you're able to come at the end of the month, fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Yeah, it's been touch and go with travel, obviously, and this entire book tour has been virtual. Book just came out last week, and my first event was in Scottsdale, though I was here in New York, and I did an event last night in Houston from here in New York, and now I'm doing my Canadian launch in Toronto, but here in New York. But yes, at the end of the month, I am so excited to say I will be able to see friends and family in Toronto, and I absolutely cannot wait. So I will be up.
It's been a long time. Was it an easy pivot for you to go to a virtual tour, or has it really had
you know, I will say there are some things that I love about it and that I'd love to keep doing about it, because what I realized is that as much as it's fantastic to go and do events in person, and it's so exciting to see people and you get a lot of energy actually from that, there are so many people who have mobility challenges or different issues where they can't go to an event. And so one kind of silver lining in the last year and a half or so is that by doing virtual events, it sort of opened up this world of events to people who couldn't normally go. And I think in an ideal world, yeah, I'd love to be doing in-person events, but I'd like to live stream them so that other people can see them, whether it's a geographic issue, a health issue, whatever it is, you don't have to miss out just because you can't get there in person. So I'm hoping if there's, sort of any good things that come out of the last year, it's that we'll think more about how to make things accessible to people, and how to be more inclusive.
Absolutely. And it has opened up sort of audiences as well, hasn't it? You can go around the world. Anybody could be watching this anywhere.
Yeah. One of the amazing things, I mean, normally if you do an event, it's sort of like, well, you're there or you're not. So you got it or you didn't. And I've seen with different events that I've done, I remember being blown away. I did an event that had, I think it was maybe 100 people turn out for the event. And I thought, oh my goodness, like this virtual stuff is amazing.
Yeah.
The next day when I went and looked, there had been more than 1,000 views. And so
Wow.
it's not just, who turns up in that moment. You also get people who, for whatever reason, couldn't be there right when it was playing, but they're catching it later. So yeah, so stuff, I mean, or you could catch it, a month later or, 5 months later, why not? So yeah. So I will say it's hard, I think, right now still to be positive about all that we've been through, but I do see technologically there are changes that we can be making and incorporating going forward that'll, sort of, be better for writers and for audiences.
Absolutely. Well, pandemic literature, right? I mean, you signed the book deal for this in the tail end of 2019. How did the timing affect how you approached the book, or did it have an effect?
Oh my goodness, it was crazy. So so I signed the deal for this book. I want to say it was definitely second half of 2019, and I did a research trip for it, and then started writing the book. And so the first half of the book, was entirely written in pre-pandemic times. And I live in New York City, where things changed very, very, very rapidly last spring. And, I was writing this book that was set in what, to me was the normal world. And that normal world changed almost overnight. So by the time I turned the book in June 2020, it was a very different animal. It's funny actually, because the plot of the book didn't change, and it didn't affect sort of characterization so much. But I realized that this was just such a seismic event that you couldn't, the choice to not include the pandemic, it just didn't feel like a choice. I felt like if I wanted people to believe in the world of the book, if I wanted them to be engaged, my rule normally is to make things as real as possible. And so to use real life settings, to make mention of events, to ground the book in the real world. And so if I were to try to write this and not include the pandemic, it wouldn't have made sense. And I felt like I ended up maybe using it to some advantage, because the two narrators of the book are both so isolated that the pandemic almost became a kind of device where you could explain why people could have a close relationship and yet not have been in touch, not have seen each other, not have been there for key moments. And so in a way, the fact that we've all been kind of in our little pods and generally very isolated for the last year and a half or so, I think in a crime novel that can actually work to your advantage.
Sure.
Yeah, I will admit I was guessing, because the book is set in 2021, and I was guessing how things would be. And when I first turned it in, I remember my editor, she was so excited about the book, but she said, I want you to change one thing. You say that most people are vaccinated, that's just too optimistic. And that was back, she was saying that to me in June 2020. And so we were going back and forth on that into the fall. And the bit about vaccination ended up coming back into the book, because by then we knew about Pfizer and Moderna, and that they were, realistic, actionable vaccines. And so, but, stuff like that, because it was so current, we were really touch and go with it.
Absolutely. I was interested in what research you might have done to look at to imagine what the restrictions were going to be like. But
Yeah, it's funny actually, because I imagined a world where I thought of it like if you're going to have mask wearing, you're going to have it on public transit, even if you don't have it on anything else, because there's still a lot of fear and phobias about using public transit, even though it's been proven over and over that that has not been a vector for transmission. But there's still something about being contained in a subway car, that sense of being a bit trapped. And so I don't know, I guess some of it was just gut instinct.
Sure. Well, I thought some of the other details were telling too. At one point, it's mentioned that masks weren't seen in Manhattan, but they were in Queens and the Bronx. So mask wearing became associated with class. Was that something you were hoping to tease out?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if you look at even a city like New York, it's, very wealthy city overall, you look zip code by zip code, borough by borough, the effect of the pandemic was in no way evenly felt or experienced.
Yeah.
And you can look even just, for instance, at the death rates, and a good chunk of the book is set in Elmhurst, Queens, which is, where the main character Deirdre lives. But it was just a horrific spot. I felt where I live in Manhattan, because I'm close to two big hospitals, that it was kind of nightmarish because we had sirens nonstop. We had those freezer trucks, the morgue trucks. It was really grim. It was nowhere near as grim here as it was there, or in the Bronx, or parts of other boroughs. It absolutely sort of wealth and class worked into how people experience the pandemic. And so right now you have a situation in Manhattan where most places don't require you to wear a mask anymore. And the guidance has been, if you're vaccinated, you don't need a mask. And people just don't really wear masks anymore. Whereas you definitely still see a lot of mask wearing. You go outside of Manhattan, you go to Queens, a lot more people are wearing masks.
It's interesting. You're sort of bordering on talking about the darkness in the city, in the way it looks and what's happening with the pandemic. And there's a fascination. Obviously, here's a ham-fisted segue, but there's a fascination, it seems, with the darkness in people. I mean, some of the characters and scenarios in this book, and in many other of your books, they're pretty dark. They're not unbelievable, but they're pretty dark. So what is it that fascinates you about the darkness in people?
It's funny because I think maybe pre-pandemic, I used to wonder to myself about this. Like, why do I have such a dark imagination? Why do I think the worst of a lot of people? Why do I sort of expect bad things to happen? And I feel like vindicated almost from the pandemic. And part of that is just from living in the US, not really a New York experience, but around the country, hearing stories of people that would physically attack a worker in a store just because they were asked to wear a mask. People who, there was literally a bumper sticker that said, like, your health isn't my responsibility, that you just sort of saw around. All these things that sort of made it feel very, not just individualistic, but sort of like feral and selfish in the worst possible way, that only, a person thought they mattered, or maybe their family mattered, and nothing else. And I think when I'm writing fiction, I'm interested in extremes. I'm not really interested in sort of like a middle of the road person who's mostly nice and maybe just does one bad thing. I'm interested in people who've sort of committed to a worldview, however positive or negative. But absolutely, I believe even more strongly that it exists. And even now we're seeing this sort of fallout where we were doing really well on vaccinations, and now we're not doing so well, and there are variants spreading. And the reaction still from a lot of people and politicians is to say, you can't mandate, a mask, you can't mandate any other conditions, like you can't do this, can't do that, because freedom or something. I don't know. So I will say, I think at this point, my dark imagination is being mirrored by a lot of bad things that have happened in the world. And it doesn't even feel like such a departure anymore.
Which is it's a sort
It
of
was
scary thing,
terrible
isn't it?
comment, right? Like, I want to be positive,
but it is what it is. I think this book, I mean, speaking of darkness, this book's, a big part of it is dark family secrets, even the seemingly healthy families in the book. Not that there's much of that, but keep secrets from each other. Why did you want to explore that particular theme?
Oh my goodness. I love the idea of how much do we see of another person? How much do we know, even when we think we're close to them, even when there's a relationship there, maybe going back years, what is it that sort of people keep to themselves? What is it that people are afraid to reveal? Because it's almost like a pressure point on them, sort of what they value, what they're afraid of. It tells you so much about them, what they try to keep secret. And I think it matters more and more these days because in the past, you would see Hollywood stars with curated images. It really mattered who they were seen with or where they were photographed. But that's the way that average people live now and teenagers live. There's this sort of real person, and then there's the social media person. And to some extent, a lot of us are now curating our lives and we want to be seen in a certain way. We want to be viewed in a particular light. And I find that fascinating from a psychological point of view, because I don't think it's a terribly healthy thing, though I would say myself, I certainly do it too. Like if I take a photograph, I'm not going to post the unflattering photograph. I'm going to look for the flattering photograph. It's like we all want to be seen in our best lights, but to some extent, it makes us a little more dishonest because, when you're sharing that one perfect moment, like all of the blood, sweat, and tears that gone into it, you sort of write that off. And I try to be really honest in social media postings about writing because people see the end result and they get really excited. And so I've been really upfront about things like literally every book that I've published, I have thought at some point while I was writing it that I wouldn't be able to finish it.
Really?
That I didn't know what I was doing, where I was going. There's always that feeling at some point of like, why did I take this on? I think a lot of jobs, it gets easier the more you do. I have not reached that point with novel writing. It doesn't get any easier.
Yeah, it's one of those things. Now, I'm wondering, before we get we've been talking a lot sort of in big questions, and I'm thinking, we can delve a little bit more into the book and the characters and all of that stuff. I'm wondering if you want to sort of, for those who might not have read the book yet, do a synopsis or maybe read a little excerpt from the book in order to give people a sense of it.
I'm so glad you brought that up because, when Deb and I were chatting before, we'd agreed, I will read, and I'll just read a bit from the opening of the book, but to give you a sense of, flavor of the book and that. So, and I'll read from chapter 1. So I'm just going to dive in with no synopsis or explaining necessary. Just starting with the book's main character, Deirdre. I didn't know what to wear to the funeral. Any other day, I would have called my sister for advice because Carol always knew the right way to do things, but she was dead and I'd never hear her soft, husky voice again. After pulling every piece of clothing I owned, all of it black, out of the tiny alcove I used as a closet, I put on a tunic that could pass for a dress. Then I added tights and a cardigan that hid the tattoos on my arms. My feet went into a pair of expensive, impractical heels that could only have been a present from my sister. Climbing the stairs out of my basement apartment in Queens, I felt queasy. But it wasn't until I took the subway into Manhattan and stood in front of the church that I felt like an imposter. Your name and invitation, demanded a uniformed security guard. Deirdre Crawley, I'm Caroline Thraxton's sister. The guard said something I didn't catch because I was staring at the facade of the church, awash in deja vu. Catholic churches with elaborate stone scenes of the resurrection or judgment day were a dime a dozen. This one had the crucifixion front and center, rendered with a grim intensity that hollowed out my chest. St. Vincent Ferrer, I murmured. This was the church where my sister had gotten married 4 years earlier. "What was the number on the back of your invitation?" the guard asked, clearly unsure whether he needed to be polite to me. I blinked, trying to picture it. Some Thraxton minion had couriered the invitation over at 6 o'clock Monday evening. Remembering Caroline Ann Thraxton, it said, stark black type embossed on thick ivory stalk. "Please join us for a memorial service and luncheon." It had chilled me, the elegantly thorny black vines winding around her name, ready to choke it. It started with a 7. There had been 6 digits on the back, but only one came to mind. I'd thrown the invitation onto my bookcase and hadn't glanced at it again. "You need that code," the guard said. "You can't get in without it." At that moment, a switch flipped in my brain. I'd barely slept the night before. The truth was, I'd barely slept since my sister had died. I'd made it to the church on autopilot, aware of my own steps as a zombie. But this callous creep was the first obstacle I'd encountered, and all my grief suddenly spiraled into rage. "My sister is dead, and you're not keeping me out of her funeral." My voice was razor edged. As if sensing that I wanted to hit him, the guard pulled his head back sharply. I pushed past him and stormed up the steps. Inside, white roses bloomed like a pox in the dark wood of every pew. Guests in couture laughed and gossiped. There were white ribbons and tulle wrapped around towering bouquets at the end of every aisle. The church looked exactly as it had at Caro's wedding, and I felt as out of place as I had that day. It would have made me cry if the guard hadn't been breathing down my neck. "She doesn't have an invitation," he said to whoever was listening. "She doesn't belong here." I tried to walk away, but he grabbed my wrist. I took a deep breath. "Caro, please forgive me for clocking a guy at your funeral." "She's aggressive. She shoved me out of the way," the guard was whining as I turned, balling up my right fist. "Did she really?" answered a sly voice. "Consider yourself fired." I unclenched my fist as if disposing of evidence. There was Juliet Thraxton, broad-shouldered and big-boned, in a curve-hugging black suit with a pair of diamond pins in one lapel. Her platinum blonde hair was rolled up in a chignon and tucked under a feathered black hat with a short veil. It looked like a prop from an old movie worn by a widow who'd paid some mope to shoot her husband. Her plump scarlet mouth was still moving. "Do I look like I'm kidding?" she asked the guard. "I'm not. Get out." His face was bright red. "But she pushed you out of the way. I heard you." She flicked her hand at him as if he were a mosquito. "Thraxtons don't employ losers. Go." He retreated, muttering furiously. "Thanks," I said cautiously. "Caro always said firing people gave her sister-in-law, Juliet, a purpose in life. Trust you to liven up a funeral." She gave me a thorough once-over and raised an eyebrow as if I'd failed to meet expectations again. Juliet was the queen of barbed quips, and for a moment I thought she was about to strike. Instead, she sighed. "You probably want to see Teddy," she said. "He's up front with his nanny." "How's he doing?" "He's having a tough time, poor kid." She started to turn away. "Don't go looking for trouble. It finds you without any help," she added cryptically before gliding off. I wasn't sure if that was a dig about the guard she'd fired or a reference to my father. I scanned the crowd but couldn't spot him. He had to be lurking in the shadows with the other monsters. I felt conspicuous, parading up the center aisle of the church. People turned to glance at me, but I wasn't important enough to speak to. My sister's casket sat at the front of the altar, but I wasn't ready for that. Instead, I looked for my nephew. Teddy was wearing the world's tiniest, sharpest black suit, complete with a white boutonniere. He stood on the pew to hug me. "Auntie Dee," Teddy sighed into my neck. What could I say to a 3.5-year-old whose mother had died suddenly? Everyone who knew Caroline was still reeling from the shock. If it was hard for me to comprehend, it had to be impossible for her son. I had no idea what his father had told him. "You're a tough guy, aren't you?" Tough was the biggest compliment my family offered. Nice was fine, smart was good, but tough was what we aimed for. "Yep," he answered proudly. Gloria Rivera, his nanny, got to her feet. She was anywhere between 30 and 50. It was impossible to tell. Petite and raven-haired, her face round and her eyes brimming with sympathy. "I'm so sorry, Deirdre." "Thanks." She was the only person in that church who'd said those words to me. When Teddy finally let go, I drifted towards my sister's casket, pulled along by some invisible cord. The upper portion was open, so you could see Caro's perfect, unblemished face. My sister looked like nothing so much as Sleeping Beauty, golden blonde and rosy cheeked. I could almost imagine her sitting up suddenly, smiling as if this were all one big stunt to reunite our fractured family. I didn't know I could miss anyone this much, I whispered. For a moment, in spite of the chattering crowd behind us, it felt like we were alone in that cavernous church. And then the spell was broken, and a hand brandishing a gold platter ring touched down on the polished wood of the casket. I recognized my father before I saw his face. This was the moment I'd been dreading. My sister in life had run interference, keeping my father and me segregated in our respective corners on those rare occasions when we were forced into the same room, at Caro's own wedding, our mother's funeral, and Teddy's christening. We stared at each other for a moment. His blue eyes were hard and cold. The air around us was poisoned. Nothing had changed. He opened his mouth to speak, but I turned and stepped away before he had the chance. The minor chords of the pipe organ underscored the ugliness of the moment. I stumbled down the aisle. Was it my imagination, or were people staring? At the wedding, I'd heard someone say, "Can you believe Theo married her?" There'd been no end of comments about what a lucky girl my sister was. One bejeweled, bouffant-haired guest even said to Caro, "You must feel like Cinderella." My impossibly elegant sister couldn't come up with a better response than a shell-shocked smile. At her funeral, the mood wasn't any different, even if the lucky girl was now lying in a casket. I needed fresh air. There was a lump in my throat I couldn't swallow. My mind tripped over what my mother would have thought of the scene. Her eldest daughter dead, her husband and younger daughter at daggers. My mother had always seemed sad when I was growing up. No matter what good thing was on the horizon, there was a dark shadow trailing behind it. If I was honest, she hadn't been wrong. As I exited the church, the guard shot me a curious glance, but the one who'd hassled me was gone. I clattered down the steps. It was a sunny day for April. I stayed upwind of a forlorn clump of smokers. On the sidewalk stood a creep with a camera, and he pointed the lens at me. I turned away, pulling out my phone. I needed a distraction before I exploded. That was the moment I first saw the email. "You have a private message from Caroline Crawley." My sister had been Caroline Thraston since her wedding day. The sight of her birth name made the message seem like something out of time, a digital relic of a person who'd vanished 4 years ago. When I clicked on it, the screen turned parchment yellow. "Osiris's vault keeps all your data safe and secure," read the text at the top of the screen. "Caroline Crawley wants you to read this letter." There was an image of Osiris, the green-faced Egyptian god who was hacked to bits by his brother and reassembled by his sister. Mythology had been my thing as a kid, and I still loved it. Kara liked to tease me about that tattoo of an ankh, the Egyptian key of life, on my shoulder. Was this a sick joke? I scrolled down. Written above a text box were the words, "Caroline's message to you." I took a breath. "Deirdre, I keep thinking of Mom and how you never believe you're going to end up like one of your parents until you do. If you're reading this, I'm already dead. No matter what it looks like, my death won't be an accident. Theo killed his first wife and got away with it. Bring him to justice no matter what you have to do. I love you, Dodo, always. Kara."
Ooh, and that sets us up for all those deep, dark family secrets we alluded to a little bit earlier. Now, Deirdre, is she, do you think, an unreliable narrator? I mean, the trope of the unreliable narrator has been used prodigiously over the last dozen years or so. There's a difference, though, I think particularly in thrillers and mysteries, between being unreliable and being mysterious and allowing the story to unfold in a way that builds suspense, isn't there? What are the nuances?
I would agree with that. I have been surprised because there have been a few reviews that have talked about my unreliable narrators, and I don't actually feel that she's unreliable at all. She is keeping secrets. There is no doubt about that. And as you follow her through the book, what you realize is that she won't tell you anything about her family unless it's absolutely necessary. She's sort of internalized this idea that you don't talk outside the family, you don't talk out of turn, you don't reveal yourself. But in terms of what she does tell the reader, she is completely sincere in her grief. The things that she tells you are true. And I think of it almost like like to me, my characters are real people. Like these are people that I know, that I have spent a lot of time with. And when you meet someone, they don't spill out all of their secrets to you on first meeting. Or if they did, you'd kind of run away because you know there's something wrong with that situation if they did. So I think of it like as you build a relationship with her, as you spend more time with her, things are teased out. And there are certain scenes where there are revelations that she's forced to make, that basically she's cornered, that something has happened, that someone else has discovered something about her family, and it forces a revelation. But I just think of it like you need to spend time with a character to get to know them, and calling them unreliable because they don't tell you everything on page one is unfair. One of the things that really shaped her was growing up in a family where there was physical abuse. And it wasn't really directed at her, but it was in her parents' relationship mostly. And her father used to hit her mother. And this was something that, to Deirdre, it is like a betrayal still to talk about that, even though her mother is dead now. It still feels like a bridge too far. But I just don't think that the secrets that she keeps makes her unreliable at all in terms of the path that she goes on looking for justice or looking for the truth. I feel like she's very honest and very upfront about all of those things.
And you, in the narrative, it's not just Deirdre who's the narrator, though. You've got sort of a dual narrative going on. You've got Deirdre and then Theo, and they're both very, very distinct in what they're telling. Why did you decide to go that way with the two?
Well, I will admit, I will tell you the truth here. When I first was writing the book, I really envisioned it being from Deirdre's point of view. And even though I don't outline, I knew where it began and knew where it ended, and I knew the journey that she was on. And as I was writing the book, and it's hard to say exactly whether it's maybe a quarter of the way through or a third of the way through, I started to think, what if I were to write a chapter or two from the point of view of the husband who killed his first wife and may or may not have been involved in Caroline's death? Like, what if I did that? And so when I first wrote from his point of view, it was as an experiment, and I was not sure that I could really pull it off. I thought I might be giving away too much to the reader, that it might really sort of dampen the suspense in the book. But once I started on that path, I realized that he's a fascinating character in his own right. And one of the things that sort of intrigued me about him is that he grew up in an abusive family as well. Very different from Deirdre's in that there was not physical abuse, but there was sort of intense emotional abuse, gaslighting, manipulation. His father constantly setting up this rivalry between Theo and his sister so that the two of them would never be close. And so I started to realize that sort of Theo, with this kind of strange world that he's come out of, and because of his substance abuse problems that have plagued him in the past, a memory that isn't always reliable. I mean, this is a person who can't really trust himself. I think maybe when people are talking about my unreliable narrators, they're really thinking of Theo. But in terms of what Theo reveals to you, he reveals what he knows. When he's unsure about something, he also lets you know that. And I think it reveals him as damaged as he really is, this person who can't really trust himself. But that's where he's coming from. And so, yeah, once I started writing from that point of view, it was actually, I realized it gives readers a whole other perspective. You have these two characters that are actually very sincere in wanting to know the truth and get to the truth, but they have completely different information and interpret things in completely different ways. So it's kind of head spinning because you as the reader, like, who do you put your trust in?
Yeah. And it allows you to stand back and start weaving sort of theories of your own. So you become sort of an active participant in the creation of the story, right? In that way.
Yeah. I mean, my hope always is that it comes to life in the reader's mind. And so I feel like that sort of engages your emotions. It pulls you in, whether you want to be pulled in or not, because you, the reader, have decisions to make about who to trust.
Absolutely. Now, one thing I found interesting about Theo, I mean, as you said, he's damaged and he's abused, but he's also very self-abusive. I mean, he cuts himself, and he looks for the physical pain. Now, I thought that was interesting because it's usually, not always, but usually a behavior that's associated with girls. I thought it was an interesting element in the psychology of the story. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, yeah. So this was an issue that fascinated me. There was a book I read a few years ago about self-harming that sort of it was so enlightening to me because I think I'd always wondered, why would people do this to themselves? Like, why would anyone inflict, pain on themselves? And I didn't understand it as kind of a private release,
Yeah.
that for people who do this, often they're in so much emotional pain and emotional turmoil that the only way to sort of survive that, or to sort of get temporarily relieved from that,
Yeah.
is to actually harm themselves. And yeah, it absolutely is a phenomenon that's more associated with women. But part of that was because there's this sort of an image of women that's very restrictive. And I felt like
Yeah.
Theo, in a way, because of growing up in this wealthy family where image was so important, where, he kind of couldn't put a foot wrong, that this would become kind of a private refuge for him, that he wouldn't
Mhm.
be able to seek help, show the world that he's in turmoil. And so what does it become? It's basically drugs and self-harming. And
Yeah.
that sort of is like his private release. In the book, he has gotten away from both of those behaviors for several years, but you will see he kind of quickly, it's not a spoiler because we're talking about something in the first 5 chapters of the book,
Mhm.
you do see him begin to self-harm again because of the turmoil in the aftermath of his wife's death.
Mhm. Now, he wasn't the only person dealing with mental health issues or addiction issues. Can you talk about how you approached mental health in the book? Because it seems to me it's a big thread sort of running through it.
Yeah, to me, this is fascinating. I honestly wish people would talk more about trauma. I feel like it's something that I've tried to be very explicit about, both in my books and in nonfiction writing as well. And though I'm also aware of the reasons why people don't want to talk about it, just
Sure.
briefly, I was involved in an incident when I was in my first job out of university, where a man came into my workplace and tried to kill everyone there in an
Oh
arson.
my gosh.
It was a government office. He was a veteran. He had first tried to buy grenades, but had been unsuccessful in that, and so decided to start a fire. We were
And
up
this
on
was in
the
Toronto.
in Toronto. Yeah, this was actually the Veterans Affairs office that used to be at Bay and Bloor, just
Oh
a
my
block
gosh.
north of Bloor. And it's so powerful in my memory that day. And yet at the same time, there were parts that I've forgotten. I still remember the smell of gasoline when he came in and poured it on our carpet. I went to the door of my cubicle and saw him like basically open a lighter and throw it down. And then it was just a wall of flame. And I remember virtually nothing after that until I was down 7 floors down on the street. And for years, I didn't want to talk about it. I really minimized it. Just after that happened, I actually flew to New York to interview for an internship at Harper's Magazine. And I remember mentioning it to them. I think I brought a news article with me saying, oh, yeah, that was my office. Basically, someone tried to kill us a week ago, and sort of spinning it into this story that I was very blasé about. But in reality, that was a facade. That was a mask I was wearing, where I wanted to pretend that I was okay and that I hadn't been affected by that, and that I wasn't, thinking like grim and deadly thoughts as a result. That I wasn't feeling a lot of fear when I was out that someone might attack me again. And so I realized, like for years, I basically. Tacked that down. And it was really funny. It was years later in New York, I was called for jury service. And one of the questions that we were asked when we were impaneled was whether we'd been the victim of a crime. And I started to answer, talking about the fire, and I burst into tears. And I am not a person who's normally a crier. And it all welled up. And I remember I had a writers group I was part of, and I think it was like the next night I was meeting with them and I told them what had happened. And they were all saying, like, we've known you for practically a decade and this has never come up. Like, this is, you've never talked about this. Like, you should write about it. You should process this. And so it made me really think a lot about how much people carry around with them that they don't deal with, that they sort of, that the trauma is still living somewhere inside them. It's very raw. And so I think in every book that I've written, it's not that the characters are mentally unstable, but there is trauma. There's always trauma lurking under the surface. And part of the journey that they're on is exposing that trauma, but then being able to get past that trauma, because it is only when you acknowledge these things that you actually then sort of have the emotional strength and wherewithal to get past them. Otherwise they can creep up on you and sort of surprise you at terrible moments. So with both of these characters, I would say Deirdre is someone who, she's very tough, very strong. That's her self-image. Her response, if she's upset, is to be very quick to anger, which is a defense mechanism. People might not really look at her as damaged, but that's how she's covering up her trauma. And in Theo's case, it's been more destructive. I would say there's definitely more of a mental health issue there, partly because he has no one around him that he can trust. Deirdre at least has a close friend that is like a sister to her that she can rely on. Theo doesn't really have anybody in his life except his 3.5-year-old son, who he, has as a person who he can feel close to without also being afraid of that person. So so there's an awful lot of trauma to be processed there.
Yes, and we all deal, I guess, people who have, PTSD, because that's sort of what you're talking about there, different ways of dealing with it. Deirdre escapes in different ways, as you say, but karate is one of her big escapes, and her local dojo is a safe space for her. What inspired that?
Yeah, I will say that is a direct transplant of my dojo from when I was growing up in Toronto.
Oh,
so,
wow.
My friends, if any of my longtime friends are on here, this is no surprise to any of them, but people who've met me more recently are often surprised. So I grew up doing martial arts. My parents started me in judo when I was 7, and that didn't really take because I was the only girl and my instructor wouldn't let me spar with boys.
Oh.
So they moved me into karate when I was 8, where I was still the only girl, but I had an instructor who had no problem with me sparring with boys. And it was such a wonderful experience. It was the Higashi School of Karate, which used to be located on Eglinton East. I moved the dojo, even the pool hall that it was next door to, my sensei, the photograph of Dr. Chitose up on the wall, the sayings, the mantras that are on the walls. I just recreated my dojo in Elmhurst, Queens. Unfortunately, my dojo burned down from a fire that started in that pool hall back when I was a teenager. But I got so much out of studying karate, and I think it made me a more patient person. It made me a more determined person, and ironically, it made me a person who I think was more thoughtful rather than angry, because the first lessons you learn are about controlling your own anger and your reaction. You never want to get angry when you're sparring. You're going to lose control and you're going to mess up if you do that. So I feel like for me that was so valuable beyond belief. With Deirdre, I guess I set it up a little differently, where she's learned important lessons too, but because so much of her self-image is wrapped up in being really tough, being able to take anybody on, there's more violent conflict, and it's not always her fault. She has a terrible job, and at one point is assaulted by one of her clients, and she is able to do what I think anybody would want to do in that situation.
That was particularly satisfying, I have to say.
There's a lot in the book that I find, sometimes disturbing to write, but that scene was so satisfying.
Absolutely. No spoilers, but it's satisfying.
No spoilers, but I will say it's very satisfying sometimes when bad guys get what they deserve. And this is a minor level bad guy, but he really does get what he deserves. So in Deirdre's case, I will say say, I don't think it ameliorates her anger at all. I think that she's carrying a very big chip on her shoulder everywhere she goes, but that this is part of what has shaped her self-image, has given her confidence, and has given her a safe space in the world, because it is where she retreats to when she's sad. It's where her best friend knows where to find her, when she's not answering her phone. The dojo is like home to her, but like a good home that is a safe space where the people there actually relate to each other in a good way. They give each other space when they need it. It's kind.
And it's interesting too, because even though she's the poor person in the book in terms of financial wealth, she's got a safe place. But as you mentioned, Theo, who has presumably tens of millions of dollars at his disposal, he's wealthy, he's privileged, doesn't have a safe space. There's again an interesting comment on class and on the way we live.
Yeah, that's a great observation, because that was a very deliberate choice. Part of the backdrop to the book, and I'll avoid any spoilers, but it's very fair to say that I mentioned the rivalry that Theo's father set up very early on with Theo's sister, Juliet. Mm-hmm. Juliet is a little older than Theo and runs the business, a supremely smart, competent, talented person. And her father doesn't want her running the business. He wants Theo running the business, because Theo is a boy and his namesake, mm-hmm. and he wants the business to carry on through him. And so it's set up this sort of awful rivalry between the siblings, but it's also the father controlling everything. He controls the money. Theo could have money if he wanted it and if he were willing to toe his father's line, but he's made a deliberate choice, years earlier to leave the family business. He is not following the path his father wants him to follow. And so even when he's in the townhouse that his father gave him as a wedding present, but didn't sign over, the father still owns it. Yeah. He's so uncomfortable there. It's not his home. It's not really his house. And he knows that he doesn't want the family obligations that go with it. So he's trapped in a weird way, because his own resources are limited. Mm-hmm. And for his son, he wants his son to have the benefits of sort of wealth and education and things, but he's also not willing to toe the party line in the family.
And it's interesting because Deirdre, who's poor, sort of has nothing to lose in some ways. So she's got so much more freedom.
What I kind of love about her, she lives in this basement apartment. She describes it herself as a dungeon. Yeah, she's mostly subsisting on protein bars, which I will admit I did when I was an intern at Harper's. Subsisting on boxes of protein bars. If anyone wonders if it's possible to do that, I did that for several months. But yeah, basically, she has freedom. She might not have money, but she has a lot. She doesn't have any dependents. And so she doesn't really have to care what anybody thinks of what she does or the choices that she makes. It's not that she has no worries. She hates her job. There are definite financial issues. Mm-hmm. But I would say if you had to pick whose position to be in, Deirdre's or Theo's, you would want to be in Deirdre's position.
Absolutely. Now, there are a lot of plot twists in this book. So what I want to know is, do you plan it out beforehand, or do you wait and see what's suggested to you as the narrative unfolds? How do you approach your writing?
I wish I could say that I outline. I have tried outlining books, and it's never been successful. I actually handed in an outline to my publisher before I got the book deal, because this was sort of just being written on an outline. Wrote an outline for them. It was maybe 8 or 10 pages. And when I started writing the book, very quickly, I realized, oh my goodness, I hope they weren't married to that outline, because this book is going to be very different than the one I outlined to them, to the point where the villain is different. A lot of things change. I really believe in sort of going with the flow. My first drafts are messy. I would never show them to another human being. I am figuring things out in them. Characters drop in, characters drop out. But by the time I've gotten to the end of that first draft, I know what the book needs. So to me, it's really all about sort of having those thoughts down on the page and then being able to go in a second draft and sort of make sense of it. And that's when I start thinking about issues like pacing and, dialogue. And before that, it's very much like a stream of consciousness. So my mantra about it is I always think, well, if I'm surprised, the reader will be surprised. And there's a lot of stuff that the characters do that surprises me that, man, I didn't plan that. I don't know where that came from. And it's exciting because, it's like I'm channeling something or whatever. But I think of it, I used to actually kick myself because I know a lot of writers who successfully outline, and I used to really envy that. And then I've come to accept that this is just my process. This is me figuring things out. And, it's a good thing. People are surprised. People don't see these things coming because, hey, I didn't see them coming either.
Now, sort of speaking of, process and deadlines, particularly now, you signed the contract, I think we said in the fall of 2019 and delivered to a deadline in June 2020, which is what, 6-7 months? And this is a complex 300 some odd page book. How do you manage to make such a tight deadline when it's so, what's your writing day like?
That is a very generous thing for you to say. So I will admit up front that it wasn't just that period of writing. I handed the book in, and the process has been to spend 3 months doing a developmental edit after handing it in. So with my first 4 books that were with McNally, I turned my book in and it was just done. Like there was no editing. There was copy editing. I mean, there was typos and things like that are fixed, but the book went in and it was just done. And it's Thomas and Mercer is my current publisher, and it's very different. They really believe in editing the book after it goes in. So I have my editor in-house, and then there's a freelance developmental editor as well. And most of what they do is ask questions. If you were to see their notes to me, it's all like questions, which is perfect for how I work because it starts my brain spinning. It identifies any plot holes, anything that doesn't make sense or doesn't work or doesn't seem realistic.
So what kind of questions would it be?
Oh my goodness. So early on, I mentioned the pandemic stuff early on. So that was just like a very practical, we had a lot of back and forth about what the world would be like and vaccines and things like that. But there were issues, a really big one actually early on was that, so the section that I read is just chapter 1. You have Deirdre getting a note from her sister. Her steps after that, one of the first things is to go to the company that sent the message and get as much information as she can from them. They're not very forthcoming, but there's an employee there who ends up sort of unofficially helping her. And he tells her that there are 3 messages in total that her sister sent out. And one of them is to Deirdre's father. Deirdre hasn't spoken to him for years. And in the draft of the book that I handed in, the encounter between them comes much later. I was very reluctant for her to see the note. I sort of didn't want her to have the information in it. And then I got to a certain point where I realized, like, why am I holding this back? Why am I being so secretive about this note? It's such a gut punch because the letter that the father receives is a lot longer, more detailed, much more about the relationship, much more about growing up. It talks about Deirdre in it. It has some observations in it that cause Deirdre humongous amounts of pain when she reads it. But it's really like an emotional moment that has to happen and needed to happen early in the book. So, questions would be like, why so late? There was all of these sort of things I was doing, I guess, to sort of hide the contents of the note till a certain point. And it's like, why go through these contortions? And at a certain point, I was like, why am I going through these contortions? So it's in way earlier now. So things like that, because sometimes, when you're writing, these characters, what's important to them, but it can be really helpful. Another set of eyes or 2 on it where they're more impartial. They haven't been
Mhm.
inside this character's world. So I think I was thinking of it like, this is so hard for Deirdre. And for them, it was like, no, this is a really important development and kind of a huge push for her. And, she really needs this earlier on. So it's
It
that
kind of
kind of
forces you
thing.
to step back too and be
Yeah,
the author again, as opposed to so wrapped up in the characters. Now,
exactly.
you've written it's about 4 minutes to 8, so we've got
Oh my goodness.
I know, how quickly is this gone? So I'll ask maybe one or two more questions. I guess we haven't gotten any questions that I can see from the Facebook page, but I'm double devising here, so it might
Yeah, oh,
be
thank you. No, I know. I brought my
either that or
phone
we're
along
doing a
too, so
really
I could
good job in answering everyone's questions. Um, but you've written, 2 series, right? The Lily Moore series and the Shadow of New York series, and then just a couple of standalones. So how do you compare the two? I mean, there's a propulsion that must keep the series going. Does that sort of propulsion, does that principle apply in writing a standalone? How do they
Oh,
compare?
wow. That's such a great question. So they're so different in my mind. I think with writing the series, it's almost intoxicating because it's wonderful to start a book and to know the character, your main character that you're writing about, and not to be discovering that person, not to have it be like you're meeting a stranger and you've got to get to know them. Because with, a new book, if it's not a series book, that's an intense process where you're trying to figure this person out and trying to get a handle on them. So it's wonderful in that way. It does have its limitations because you are, I don't think, ever going to be able maybe to surprise the reader so much. It's almost like you have a kind of contract with the reader. That's how I feel about it anyway, that if you're writing a series character, it's wrong and unfair to completely do a 180 turn, maybe suddenly make them the villain in something, or it isn't right. There's a world that you set up and it operates in a certain way, and you need to play fair with the reader. So it does mean that it limits what you can do. The one thing that drives me nuts about it is that I find myself going back and looking at what I wrote in the earlier books, because there'll be some offhand little detail about, their favorite color or some song that they love. And it's like, what was that again? When I wrote that, that was just, a nanosecond blip in my mind. And,
Now you're married to it
matters.
for the next however many
Yeah,
books,
you'll
right?
hear about it from readers. Oh my goodness, if you ever get anything like that wrong, like you will absolutely hear about it from readers. So I do find like I end up going back and like, oh, I need a character Bible. What did I say about this or that? So with standalones, by comparison, it is like, being on a high wire without a net, because
Okay.
you are out there. Everything is possible. Everything is open. You don't have that safety net, though, of a familiar world that readers already like and characters that they have a relationship with. So you definitely, there's a lot more risk, and it is scarier at the outset trying to construct a book. The book before this, Don't Look Down, was the second book in the Shadows of New York series. And each of those books are told from 4 different perspectives, but at least one of those perspectives is always going to be a police perspective from Sharon Sterling's point of view. And it's like, when you know that voice, it becomes your anchor. So this book had no anchor. It just felt like anything could happen. And maybe that encourages the feeling I talked about at the beginning, where I think, oh my goodness, what am I doing with this? Where am I going? Am I going to be able to finish it? That hits harder with a standalone, definitely.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, we've hit 8 o'clock now. I don't know if Ben's going to come on and say so long, or whether we're just going
I was going to say, I know it's like, it's all totally an experiment. I'm just checking here to see too if there were any questions. You've been asking such amazing, thoughtful questions that I feel like, you sort of hit so many of the essential points, the important points. So
that's good. And you've been so generous with your answers. So that's always something
Honestly, and I don't think I thanked you properly yet, but I was so delighted actually when Ben and Rupert said that you were interested in doing the interview. I can't thank you enough for doing this.
My pleasure. It's been so much fun. Reading the book was a blast, and maybe we'll do it again sometime.
Yeah, definitely. I don't know if Ben is coming back. I guess, you know what, let me just, I'm just double checking in the Zoom that he hasn't popped back on. Nope. I was just, because there's a green room, but he isn't in it.
No.
But I mean,
we actually had one question come in. Did we
go
over
excellent.
time, or I mean, I've got more questions, but if we want to take, just because it's a viewer's question,
Sure.
where do you get your ideas for new books? Asks Dina Weisberg.
Oh, wow. So it's always very serendipitous. I will say I have a lot more ideas than I have time to write them. Sometimes they end up in short stories instead of a book. But what always happens, the process for me is always about character first. It's character before plot. And it comes from hearing a character's voice, sort of knowing something about that character and getting emotionally engaged in their world. And so in this case, the idea of Deirdre being at her sister's funeral and getting this message, which it has enough family references in it that she believes it's from her sister, but she wonders a little if her sister has lost her mind, or, you know, what happened to her before she died. But I had that feeling of sort of just being intrigued with that character. It was kind of like it hit me emotionally too. And it's hard to explain why, because I'm not in the same situation. I don't have a sister. I mean, it's not like I'm putting myself in her shoes, but it's like a voice that I hear so strongly in my head. And I usually play around with it a little bit, because when it starts, I don't know if it's going to be a book or not. There are sometimes really strong voices that I hear that end up going into short stories. And, you know, there's one coming out next month in Ellery Queen's mystery magazine called Weed Man, that it's the same kind of like really strong voice that I heard. It's a man who's has a weed boutique, is making money hand over fist, but he encounters his former weed dealer who's just gotten out of jail after about 25 years in jail. So you never know kind of where the idea will take you. So I just start writing, and it's a bit of a process sometimes figuring out whether that's going to actually, is there enough there for a book? But if I hear a character's voice strongly enough, it will turn into something.
That's great. Okay, well, there we go. Thank you so much for this, and we'll do it again sometime.
This was wonderful. Thank you so much, Deb. Thank you, Ben McNally and Rupert McNally, very much for having me and for selling the books. And just to remind people, if you want a signed copy, you absolutely can get a signed copy, a personalized copy. Just call or email Ben's and be able to get that to you in about 3 weeks or so. So, you know, fingers crossed. But thank you everyone for tuning in, for watching. It's been terrific.
Take care and best of luck with it. Okay.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.